Her head was severed with an axe, unevenly, with the crack of vertebrae and the executioner's cry. It rolled across the boards, hit the edge of the trough, and a rattle escaped from her mouth, which one of the guards later described as like a prayer. They grabbed her with veils and immediately plunged her into a vat of holy water. But by evening, the water in the vessel had turned black. The king's death was not officially announced until the third day. Until then, the body remained in a closed hall of St. Louis Cathedral, guarded and sealed on both sides. Reports mention that no one opened the doors, but several witnesses claimed to have heard breathing and barely discernible words coming from inside. One of the priests assigned to pray at the body during the night disappeared and was found dead, his face burned and his pupils scorched. The scribe who recorded these events did not live to see the dawn. He was found dead, his face buried in an inkwell, his tongue torn out. The king died, or was killed, in the middle of autumn, on the 40th day of his illness, when the rot inside him reached his ears. His servants noticed how he cried out when he thought someone was whispering directly into his brain. Pus flowed from his throat onto his pillow at night, and his bedding had to be changed twice a night. Starting in the third week, the king stopped getting up. He didn't recognize anyone except an old monk who had been praying over him since the fever started. The monk's name has not been preserved, but the doctor's notes say, while the old man was reading prayers, the king's tongue was covered with bloody cracks as if struck by knives. Doctors summoned from 3 different monasteries gave different opinions, but agreed on one thing. The king was rotting from the inside. One claimed that wet rot had settled in his lungs. The second, that his liver had ruptured and blood was accumulating under his skin. During the autopsy, while he was still alive, more than half a liter of black liquid was extracted, which was described as stinking swamp oil. The king continued to undergo bloodletting 6 times a day. The blood was dark, did not clot, and smelled like rotten fish. The king's chambers were curtained and aired by soldiers wearing masks. Access to him was restricted. Even his sons could only enter with the blessing of the cathedral's abbot. From a letter from the head of the royal guard, 3 courtiers tried to bring food or ointments to his chambers, but were stopped. One servant was hanged for trying to sneak in at night. Panic broke out among the courtiers. Rumors of a curse brought on by the reformers grew. It was written that the king himself had confessed to the murder of the infant in the name of victory over the uprising. Rumors multiplied, and listeners noted that his name was no longer mentioned in prayers in one of the chapels. 20 days after the onset of decay, the king's face swelled so much that his eyes disappeared under the sagging skin. His eyelids would not close. He tried to speak, but his voice broke into a screech. Then one of the doctors suggested lubricating his throat with fat from dead animals. The screams that night could be heard even in the Queen's chambers. From the memoirs of a court priest, he lay like a beast wrapped in rags, gasping as if breathing his last. And in between fits, he cried out to those he had long ago executed. 2 days before his death, according to rumors, he ordered his tongue to be cut out so that he would not talk to the devil. The cutting was not carried out, but his lips were sewn shut so that he could not scream at night. The fabric tore, the stitches burst, and black pus accumulated in the corners of his mouth. The smell from his chambers became unbearable. The dogs guarding the entrance had to be replaced with horses. The dogs began to bark and howl. One of the monk brothers, who had been embalming him before his death, described in a note, "The skin on his chest opened up like cracked bread, and through it you could see his beating heart, covered with a dark film. On the 38th day, the disease spread down the body. The testicles turned black, and the urine became dark green and mixed with blood. All underwear was burned after each change. The hands trembled, and the nails began to peel off. Prayers were recited continuously, but no one came close. The servants threw water and ointments from the doorway. Only one monk continued to sit by the bed, placing his hand on his forehead until the skin began to peel off under his fingers. According to the nightly reports, by the 40th day, no one was speaking in the room. Only wheezing, screeching, and occasionally faint words could be heard. Official death was not recorded until steam began to rise from the body, and the skin on the face turned ash grey. However, according to 3 witnesses from the guard on the night when the head was severed, it opened its mouth. One of them swore that he heard, "Forgive me." The nights grew worse. 2 armed men stood guard around the closed doors of the king's bedroom, changing every 4 hours. The court physician, thin and with a constant tremor in his fingers, left the room only to change the bandages and dip the scalpels in vinegar. A bone bowl filled with pus and clots of blood once tipped over, and the smell was so bad that the Duke of Orleans, who had come in at the Queen's call, immediately jumped back, choking. According to reports compiled later by servants in a monastery cell under the dictation of the Inquisitor, during that week, the ruler no longer recognized his entourage. He addressed a shadow in the corner, whispered episcopal formulas, and once tried to confess to his own pillow, calling it by the name of his dead confessor, a servant named Barthélemy, who was later burned for false testimony, claimed, "I saw his right nostril oozing a whitish mucus, and there was something in it that moved like worms in damp bread." No one confirmed this, but Barthélemy's body disappeared from the cell before the execution. Only his burned tongue was displayed in the square. According to the records of the Bishop of Rouen, by the beginning of the 2nd week, the skin on the king's left leg had turned black, like rotten wood. Local surgeons cut away the dead flesh, but each time the rot returned. His fingers began to twist at the joints, and a yellow tumor burst on his neck. When it was pressed, something described in the report as thick darkness, exuding horseradish and soap, gushed out. The Queen prayed incessantly. The candles in her chambers did not go out, but they smoked so much that the ceiling turned black. Her letters to the Archbishop of Tours contain the following lines: "If the Lord still hears us, let him not allow his anointed one to die like a dog, in filth and oblivion." The answer came 7 days later. "The Lord has allowed even worse, Mother." While the body rotted, panic gripped the court. The old ministers gathered in secret to discuss how to inform the elders of the people of the death, even though the king was still breathing. But no decision was made. Every evening, his voice rang out again. He sang psalms. Through the pus, blood, and coughing, he still sang. It frightened even those who believed in miracles. His voice was trembling, hoarse but clear. Some swore they heard the words distort, becoming foreign, as if spoken not from his chest, but through an empty skull. The monks of the monastery of St. Louis compiled a special testimony, presented only behind closed doors. "We are certain that something unclean has taken up residence in his body, for during the liturgy in His Majesty's chambers, All 3 crucifixes darkened. The holy water on the windowsill foamed. An autopsy was not yet being discussed. He was still alive, but he was breathing only through his mouth, wheezing, and with each exhalation, a foul-smelling vapor escaped along with the air. The doctors argued. Some suggested cutting off his swollen tongue, others drilling a hole in his skull to release the pressure. A doctor from Avignon, without waiting for permission, rushed into the chambers with a red-hot needle and tried to insert it into the king's ear. He was dragged out by his feet. Security was tightened. Close relatives were not allowed to enter. The servants who brought food no longer crossed the threshold. The food was passed through a curtain, and the empty dishes were returned with dried stains of unknown mucus. One of the guards, named Jacques of Liège, saw a dark liquid slowly flowing across the bedroom floor that night. It was moving, he said, before disappearing forever. The court records preserved the remark of a notary. The entire body is covered with cracks from which small white crystals protrude. They look like salt, but they are bitter and burn the skin. When you try to scrape them off, they crumble into dust. A migration began in the palace. Those who were close to the king gradually moved away from the center. The papal legates, who had arrived for a 3-day visit, left the castle after the second night. They left no written explanation. By the 3rd week, the pillow under his head was changed 3 times a day. All the previous ones had rotted into wet rags. The bed was burning, and the stench was soaking into the stone. The servants began to mix incense and ashes from the bones of saints into the coals, but nothing helped. But he still whispered through saliva, blood, breath, texts, psalms, not always those known to the monks. One of them, an old man from Blois, burst into tears. He is singing words that are not in the scriptures. This is not a prayer. It is a curse. The king's resting place was no longer aired out. By order of the senior surgeon, the windows were boarded up and the cracks were plugged with tarred tow. The stench emanating from the body had soaked into the panels, the draperies, and even the skin of the guards. Those who had been on duty at the doors for more than one shift began to complain of headaches, weakness, burning eyes, and auditory hallucinations. One soldier, according to the captain's report, fled to the kitchen cellar, claiming that he had heard His Majesty calling his name through his sewn-up lips. Inside, on black sheets, under 2 layers of cloth soaked in vinegar and egg blood, lay a body. The head, severed before the funeral rites, was placed in a wooden box, inside which was a bowl of holy water, brought from the Lourdes spring. On the 3rd day after death, green spots appeared on the neck, and by order of Cardinal de Broglie, urgent ritual treatment began. He ordered the head to be removed, wiped with a cloth, psalms read over it, and then placed back in the water. However, as Bishop Mondrian noted in his report, when the head was removed, a slight muffled sound was heard, as if air were escaping from a rotten fruit. The servants who were present during the procedure refused to continue the service. One of them, a cook from Cana, testified under oath. His Majesty's eyes were half open, and it seemed as if he was looking not at us, but somewhere through. His lips trembled, and I heard a whisper, like a prayer, but with a hoarse sound. This servant was later found dead in the hallway, with his skull crushed. According to the official version, he slipped and fell. Officially, the king was to be buried on the 7th day, but the ceremony was postponed. The reasons were not disclosed. Secret records of the embalmers, found much later, stated that the facial tissues began to separate from the bones despite being rubbed with ointments made of incense, resin, and egg yolk. On the instructions of the apothecary of Saint-Remy, the vessels containing the embalming fluid had to be heated and poured directly into the larynx, which began to disintegrate, oozing grey, sticky pus. One of the assistants who recorded this procedure noted, "When we injected the mixture, His Majesty's ear swayed as if in response. At the same time, other processes were taking place in the corridors of the palace. The heir, Prince Adelaar, was locked in the North Tower, supposedly for his own safety. According to rumors, he refused to recognize the will signed by his father in his final hours. The old Chancellor d'Estève proposed to convene an emergency council, but 3 of the 9 members of the council were already absent, some due to illness, others on personal business. One was found strangled in his own cell. Leaflets appeared stating that the king's death was unnatural and that the body is avenging the deception. Testimony gathered from monks allowed to pray in the hall, with the body pointed to increasingly strange occurrences. One monk wrote, "At night, there is a crackling sound, as if wood is breaking. The dogs in the courtyard howl incessantly. One of them died, tearing its throat out. The prayers intensified. Services continued around the clock. The second hall, where the head was moved, was specially lined with lead. The shutters were closed. Candles burned constantly inside, and resin was burned. But neither the smell of incense nor the salt, scattered in the corners, helped. According to the apothecary, on the 4th night, the water in the vat with the head turned black and hissed like boiling water. At this time, the body began to change color. The skin slid off the abdomen, revealing intestines from which maggots were already emerging. Adele de Treville, widow of the Minister of Seals, wrote in her diary, "Rumors about the whispering head continue unabated. People are afraid to approach the palace. They say that thistles have grown near the chapel and that horses refuse to pass by the north wall." Meanwhile, 3 groups of heirs, supporters of the prince, the widowed queen, and the Duke of Lorraine, began secret negotiations with representatives of the clergy. The word heresy was heard more and more often. One of the cardinals left for a monastery without explaining why. Another, on the contrary, began to collect evidence of the spiritual corruption of the deceased monarch. One of the surgeons, who later fled abroad, stated in his sworn testimony, "When I extracted the remains of the tongue from the larynx, it was not rotten. It was as if it had just been torn out of a living person." The same surgeon disappeared the next day. He was found a week later in a ravine, his face cut off and his mouth wrapped in cloth. Rumors of a living corpse spread throughout the district. Priests began to forbid the king's name from being spoken aloud. Pilgrims avoided the palace. Fear intensified in the capital itself. Bakers began adding ash to bread, supposedly to cleanse themselves of filth. The doctors were powerless. One of them, an old man named Gerard, said in confession, "I don't know who lies in the sarcophagus, but it's not the one I've been treating for the last 3 years." On the 3rd night, when the walls of the chapel were saturated with the smell of wax, vinegar, and rotting flesh, one of the junior priests, according to the records of the Inquisitor's notary, a certain Brother Matthias, heard a faint buzzing like a voice pierced by a draught. A whisper, barely audible, floated from under the lid of the vessel where the disfigured face of the monarch lay immersed in holy water. The clergy ordered the water to be changed immediately and the vessel to be cleaned. But, as shown in the report of the apothecary Jerome, after 6 hours, The liquid darkened again. The smell became stronger. The skin began to crawl off the cheeks and forehead, as if torn off by the hand of a living person. Meanwhile, in the fortress itself, from where the king's body had been taken, rumors began to spread. An old stableman swore that he had seen two soldiers in oiled hoods pouring something into the food served to the sovereign on the day of his last hunt. The cook, Fremy, disappeared from the city 2 days before the death. The palace guard was doubled, but the underground corridors remained unguarded, and as a servant from the West Wing noticed, one night a light was burning in the chapel, but the entrance was locked from the outside. Bishop Remel proposed to open the body and re-examine the internal organs, but his request was denied. One must not disturb the dead, whose soul is still struggling in its holy vessel, said the archdeacon. Meanwhile, in the chambers where the severed head was kept, something inexplicable began to happen. All the monks on night duty asked to be transferred to domestic duties. 2 began vomiting and bleeding from the nose. One, Brother Eustace, was soon found dead, suffocated by his own vomit, with his hands clasped around his throat. The doctor's report, copied into the castle archives, reads, "No signs of violent strangulation were found, but the deceased's face was contorted with fear. His eyes bulged out, and his teeth were broken off at the gums." After that, the vessel with the head was moved to a closed room behind the altar, but the smell of decay still seeped into the main hall. The king's second son, who had arrived from the southern province, demanded a full autopsy and public display of the body, saying that poison or witchcraft must be revealed for the glory of the throne. His demands were supported by the nobility, but the clergy openly opposed them. Archbishop Troyes accused the younger prince of sacrilege, for which he ordered the bishop to be imprisoned in a monastery cellar, where he soon fell ill with a fever. According to reports, he mumbled at night that the king's heart was still beating, but not from blood, but from a curse. On the same day, 2 pilgrims who had previously been at court arrived from the Holy Land. One of them claimed to have seen the king, while still alive, entrusting the drafting of his will to a secret scribe, ordering him to hide it from his elder sons. This scribe was executed on charges of forgery 10 days after the monarch's death. Records of his execution were deleted from the city archives, but a copy of the denunciation was kept in the private library of Bishop Saint-Mond. It states, "The deceased wrote the last lines on behalf of the king, not using a pen, but only his bloody finger, from which the skin was torn off every hour." The whispers did not stop. For the 5th day in a row, the nuns who changed the bandages on the glass vessel complained of headaches, itching under their fingernails, and severe itching in their ears. When one of them became hysterical, she shouted in front of the chapel, "He is asking for water, but not to drink. He is asking to be drowned again." This woman was imprisoned in a convent on the outskirts of the city, where she died 2 weeks later of unknown fever, as recorded in the chronicles. According to the abbess, she sang children's psalms in a low male voice until the very end. The smell from the room with the vessel became unbearable. Townspeople complained of nausea in the streets near the temple. Rumors began that the royal head was now muttering every night, and if anyone caught its gaze, they would die within a week. 3 palace servants disappeared without a trace. The physician Vati, who volunteered to examine the liquid, left behind only a page covered with the phrase, "The water is not holy. The water has become flesh." They only started to lift the body on the third day. Before that, the Queen's head was kept in an oak tub, filled with holy water and incense, which on the Archbishop's orders was moved to the chapel of St. Augustine. Servants claimed that the tub moved at night. One of the guards posted at the door ran away and was later found dead with his neck broken at the foot of the bell tower. According to his brother, he muttered in his sleep, "He's calling me. He's calling from the water." By that time, the body stored in the crypt had begun to decompose. Black spots appeared where the skin had been damaged when the armor was removed. A liquid with the smell of rotten eggs oozed from the mouth. According to the report of the court physician Hugo Celeste, the abdominal cavity was distended and putrid gas had accumulated in such quantities that one of the assistants lost consciousness while trying to turn the body over. Celeste requested that an autopsy be performed immediately, stating that otherwise the autopsy will happen on its own, in the coffin, in front of people, and they will think that the king is screaming. The night before the autopsy was accompanied by thunder and strong winds. The chapel where the head was kept was sealed, but in the morning the door was found open. A maid who entered to clean fainted and later confessed during questioning, "He was looking at me from the water. His eyes were open." To which the archdeacon replied, "Perhaps he was looking, but not at you. Through you, into the abyss." The autopsy was scheduled for 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The body was lifted behind closed doors, with only the doctors, the archbishop, 2 clerks and 2 guards allowed to enter. According to the records of the surgeon, Remy Lavoisier, at the first incision, black vapor with the smell of rotting blood escaped from the abdomen. The flesh at the base of the neck fell away, exposing veins filled with a thick, dark liquid in which whitish clots floated. The left lung was almost completely decomposed, and the right lung had turned into a viscous mass. However, it was during the separation of the head from the neck that an incident occurred that caused long controversy. One of the surgeons, a young apprentice named Albert, cried out, "She's still warm." At that moment, according to the chroniclers, the lips parted, and a hoarse, barely discernible sound like a word came out of the mouth. The word was not understood, but 3 people heard it. Immediately after the autopsy, the body was prepared for burial. Due to severe internal decomposition, embalming was incomplete. Foul-smelling fabrics, incense, and a mercury mixture could not stop the process of decay. According to the palace servants, the next day, his fingers turned black, his nails fell off, and his face became unrecognizable. The funeral was postponed. Panic broke out in the capital. Rumors spread that the wine in the monastery cellars had boiled, and writing appeared on the inside of the coffin. Monk Dominic, summoned to consecrate the coffin, declared, "I saw him open his eyes in the sarcophagus." He was soon found dead in his cell, his throat cut, and the words Psalm 6 written on the wall. The burial took place secretly at night. The king's head was never reunited with his body. It was buried separately in a small coffin filled with wax and lead under a slab in the chapel. The location was not marked. According to rumors, before being buried, it once again emitted a quiet moan that shook the candles. After the king's death, a struggle for power began. The eldest son, who proclaimed himself regent, ordered the arrest of all those who had participated in the autopsy. The archbishop was sent to a monastery, where he went mad and soon died. One of the surgeons disappeared. Another was found hanged in a crypt. It was declared that all who heard the whispering of the head must be removed from the council. Several months later, under the new regime, scribes were ordered to delete any mention of the head that had not cooled for 3 days from the chronicles. However, one of the surviving private reports of the Bohemian ambassador stated, "The king's death did not bring peace. The whispering remained, and it seems that now others can hear it too."